So for those of you who are listening to this video or listening to the podcast, watching this video, and you are believers, you're Christians, then just know that as you read through the prophecies of Israel here that we're going to be jumping through during this first hour, you have to realize that whether you're Jewish or not, that this is the Bible's way of portraying your relationship to God through Messiah as is seen through the lens of God's relationship to Israel. This doesn't mean that, again, all these people that Israel's going to bring, that God's going to bring back from exile, that they're salvifically saved, that they're somehow spiritually saved. That's not what it means. It's the type and shadow. It's the picture of, like, say, the Exodus story, being delivered from Egypt and being brought into the promised land is a type and shadow of being delivered from our own personal Egypt of sin and shame and being brought into a relationship with Messiah, i.e. into this spiritual promised land of heaven. So that's the bigger picture that we're reading here as well. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because it's exclusive, this salvation picture, whether it's a physical, national, political salvation, or it's a spiritual salvation, right, where it's your very soul that's saved. Either way, the bigger picture the Bible is going to always point and always paint as that this salvation is exclusive only to those who find themselves in a righteous relationship with God, whether it's at the natural level leading to spiritual salvation, or you're already a believer in Jesus and a believer in God. But either way, it's exclusive. And why is this a necessary factor to remember? Because as we begin reading through these prophecies, you have to remember that the Tale of Two Cities theme is that God punishes Israel, the righteous, Jerusalem, the righteous city, and yet he then redeems her, right? He rescues her from her oppressors, and the reason for the punishment was so that he could refine her and melt away all of the wickedness, right? And skim all that off like you would heat up metal and melt off the dross, right? Bring it to the surface so you can scoop it away and have the pure metal there. Well, the same thing goes on, is happening with Israel, the righteous city, Jerusalem. She's being punished, but it's for the purpose of restoration and refinement, and God bringing her back to Himself in righteousness. But it is not the same for the wicked city, the Babylon model that we're using in our two cities, the Tale of Two Cities. The wicked cities of the earth that Babylon personifies in my model here of the Tale of Two Cities. Babylon is a picture of the wicked cities on the earth that will go through judgment and punishment, but there's no restoration. They don't get restored to God because they're not in relationship with God to begin with. Their punishment is final. It's complete. It's a judgment unto death. And it is that wicked that we find at the very end of the book of Revelation, who stand before the great white throne judgment of God and receive that final punishment of being cast into the lake of fire, just like the Antichrist and the false beast, the false prophet, Satan himself gets cast into the lake of fire. Death and hell gets cast into the lake of fire. So the culmination of all things from God's perspective is that righteousness will be established and rewarded and live on into eternity with God. This includes righteous people and righteous nations, righteous individuals who make up righteous nations. But on the flip side of that, judgment comes down hard on wickedness. And of course, the father of wickedness is Satan himself. But all those wicked systems, all those beast empires that Satan has been using down through the centuries, right? Going all the way back to OG Babylon, Nimrod's Babylon, Genesis chapter 10, 11, and 12, that Babylon, right? Way back then. And then we see, and from the biblical perspective, we have Egypt, and then we have Assyria, then we have Neo-Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, then we have the Medes and the Persians, then we have Greece, then we have Rome, then we have all the wicked empires that have existed in this, what we might call the church age, the Ottoman empires and the Nazi regimes, and all these evil empires that Satan has obviously had his hand in, culminating in this revived Roman Empire that's going to play an important part in the New World Order. The point being is that judgment lands hard on those evil and wicked empires, and they are seen in the prophecies as having a final destruction. Maybe a partial one in the prophecies, but a final one by the time we get to the book of Revelation, where all is said and done. And they are not revived, meaning they are not redeemed, they are not purified, as it were, God takes his people out of those. In fact, he tells us, not just in the prophets, but in the book of Revelation, come out of her, my people. Speaking of this system of wickedness known as Babylon, come out of her. Why? Because I'm going to judge her. I'm going to bring her down and I'm going to wipe her out, right? And this is for righteousness' sake. Punishment has to land on righteousness, and judgment has to land because God needs to vindicate not just righteousness, but vindicate the punishment that wickedness has been persecuting the righteousness from time past, right? From the time when man stepped off the ark and started repopulating the earth. So let me stop dilly-dallying and just get through these passages. So that's what I wanted to just say. Wrongdoer. In fact, this is what the prophet says in verse 28. We can see these back to back. Zion will be redeemed, verse 27. Zion will be redeemed with justice, and her repentant ones with righteousness, right? That's the tale of two cities on the Jerusalem, the good side. Well, look at verse 28. But, right, contrast, wrongdoers and sinners together will be broken, and those who abandon the Lord will come to an end. Notice the gloomy outlook for the evil, right? The wrongdoers, sinners together, broken. Those who abandon the Lord will come to an end. There's no restoration for them. Why? Because they have abandoned the Lord, so the Lord will abandon them. That's the end of the story for those who reject God and reject his Messiah. That's the final, the big picture that I don't want you to lose sight of. All right, so using that as our kind of our theme, let's jump through a lot of passages and see if we can cover this in the next 35 or 40 minutes. Let's jump quickly. Isaiah chapter 2, God's universal reign. What the prophets are going to begin to describe is that after the eschatological judgments and wrath of Satan and wrath of God that's poured on earth, there will be a kingdom of righteousness that's going to be ushered in. And whether you believe this is a spiritual 1,000-year kingdom or a literal 1,000-year kingdom, like I believe it's a literal, either way, it's a time of righteousness when God will be the only one who's recognized, or I should say he'll be the predominant one that will be recognized. So we see this described in the headings of the chapters here. Isaiah chapter 2, God's universal reign. Notice the word which Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it will come about that in the last days, the Acharit Haimim, we could see this as the near prophecy. Remember, prophecy itself has a telescoping effect built into it, where sometimes an event is describing a near-term event or near-time happening that's near to the prophet who's writing it. And then it may come to pass in the now of the prophet, or maybe the generation, one or two generations away from the prophet. So we call that near or now. But yet at the same time, if we look at the language carefully and just confirm it with history, fact check it against the world, the state of affairs around us, we can obviously observe that there's parts of the prophecy that are not yet or far. So it doesn't matter which title you give it, near/far, or now/not yet, they're both describing the same idea, that there's this telescoping. It's like two mountain peaks seen from a distance, and you don't know the valley between the distance of the valley between the two mountain peaks, or the perspective. It's kind of an optical illusion, as it were. The prophets look like they're foretelling maybe one event. The language seems to capture one event, but in reality, it's maybe a near event and a far event, or a now event and a not yet event, something like that. So notice this language, and you can't get lost in this. The prophets don't warn you, hey, by the way, now I'm going to be talking about near. Oh, now I'm going to be talking about far. Sometimes they use key language, like it'll say, it's for the final days, or it's shut up this vision until the end, like we read in the book of Daniel, or things like that. This is for the latter days, or in the final days it will come to pass, or in the days later, or something like that. Sometimes the prophets do that, but other than that, you just have to catch the context. You got to read carefully. Not meant to be confusing, but it is meant to be that precious gem that you have to dig for. The mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as a chief of the mountains, right? Rebuilding of the temple. Remember, Isaiah's prophesying about not just the exile to Babylon, but the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But he's prophesying that the temple is going to be rebuilt and reestablished in the last days. Does this mean the rebuilt temple by King Herod? Well, in the short term of things, yes, it does. But notice the language. It will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it, and many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he may teach us about his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Okay, part of that happened in the first century, right? The temple was a house of prayer for all peoples. Jerusalem was a place where many peoples from all the nations streamed into it, and the Torah was going forth from Zion in the first century, right? So this was partially fulfilled. But notice then Isaiah shifts without telling us that he's shifting. Notice the language. And he will judge between the nations, and he will mediate for many peoples, and they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Has that happened yet? Not on your life, right? Just turn on the news, go to your computer, pull out your smartphone. There's war and rumors of wars all over the world, right? Currently, there's a massive war that's been going on for over a year in Ukraine, right, with Russia and things like that. There are skirmishes all over the world. So nation is still lifting up sword against nation. That's what's going on. So this means that this prophecy isn't fully fulfilled yet. It's only been partially fulfilled by the bringing in and the rebuilding of the temple, which now is lying in ruins, right? So that also tells us why this cannot be totally fulfilled, because currently the temple is in ruins, right? Or at least it's the Temple Mount is occupied by that Dome of the Rock Islamic shrine up there, right? That's not God's plan. That's not part of God's righteousness. That's part of the other crowd, right? So what is Isaiah and the rest of the prophets going to be doing for this? They're just going to be showing us that very early on, God is using the exile of Israel, particularly the Babylonian exile, to highlight this concept of punishment for God's people for the purpose of refining them and restoring them and redeeming them and bringing them back to himself, although a significant number of people will have to perish in that refinement and in that punishment. But there's always restoration on the horizon. The end of the picture is always going to be that God is restoring things and establishing righteousness and bringing in that which is holy and righteous. But it's not so for the wickedness that surrounds righteousness, that has always been oppressing righteousness. God has to judge wickedness, and that he will do. And so that's what we're going to be seeing as we skip through these passages very, very quickly. Notice right in the same passage, if I scroll down, it says a day of reckoning is coming. This is the day of the Lord, which is the fullest judgmental time period that God has on his calendar, and then that will be it. When it comes to judging the wickedness of mankind, what we might call era of mankind will come to an end with God's final wrath being poured out in the time period known as the day of the Lord. And so the language that you're going to find in the prophets often is this, the day, or when that day comes, or in that day. They'll use language similar to that. That'll kind of clue you into the idea of this judgment. And it's seen through the lens of the Babylonian exile, because on the near/now aspect, right, the smaller fulfillment, it's a punishment against Babylon, that wicked city who oppressed and exiled Jerusalem and the Jewish people and destroyed the temple. So the smaller sort of preteristic historical punishment that takes place is either against judgment against Israel and or judgment against the wicked nations such as Babylon or Egypt or whoever is in view of the prophecy. But the larger picture that don't want you to lose sight of when we're talking about near, far, or now and not yet, is that Jerusalem and the Jewish people still have to go through this punishment in the future as a national entity in order to bring in righteousness. And at the same time, the entire world will be judged in wickedness and righteousness as God, in judgment for their unrighteousness and for their idolatry and rejecting God and embracing the lie of the Antichrist and embracing the lie of Satan down through the ages, right? It's not just a judgment against that generation in the future. Please don't misunderstand me. The judgments that are coming upon mankind in the future is the culmination of mankind's wickedness as has existed for the entire scope of humanity. Since the time that man first ate of the forbidden fruit in the garden and sin entered into the world. From that point, judgment was already in store for mankind and in store for Satan and the Antichrist, or all of the beast systems that would rise up, and all of the idolatrous systems and wickedness and adulteries and spiritual darkness that has permeated the earth from day one. All of that has to be judged on a day that God is appointing in the future. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's not that God just suddenly says, okay, I'm just going to judge this final 7-year generation. Too bad, so sad for you guys. You guys just happen to be the one that lives during the time when I pour out all my wrath. No, that's not how it works. It's a judgment against the entire system. The entire system comes crashing down in the end, and God establishes righteousness and judges wickedness. So, for the Lord of armies will have a day of reckoning. It's the day of the Lord. On the short order, it is the punishment against Babylon and the wicked nations. But on the larger scale, it's punishment against eschatological Babylon and the end-time new world order that's going to be established. Everyone... it's a reckoning and a judgment against everyone who's arrogant and haughty, against everyone who's lifted up. Notice it's not just a judgment or reckoning against Israel, right? You have to remember the language of punishment is usually reserved for those who are God's people, but the language of judgment is best reserved for those who are not God's people. We could distinguish between those verbs, and that would be helpful, even though sometimes there's a little bit of overlap between the word judgment and the word punishment. But it's going to be helpful. It's going to actually do you a lot of good in your prophetic studies if you get that mindset established in place right up front, is that God punishes his own children and his own bride, right? Israel / the church. He punishes them, but it's in righteousness. He doesn't destroy them. It's a punishment towards reconciliation and a reestablishment of relationship. So that's the type of punishment that takes place against his own righteous people, or his people who should be righteous but are playing the harlot. They're indulged in wickedness, and et cetera, et cetera. It's for the purpose of redeeming them, rescuing them out of that, and refining them, right? Helping them to understand who's truly his bride and who isn't. But when it comes to wicked people, and I'm just going to keep stressing this because I don't want you to misunderstand. When it comes to wickedness, there's no punishment towards restoration. There's only judgment towards destruction. So notice this language and be very, very specific. Everyone who's arrogant and haughty will be brought low. It will be against all the cedars of Lebanon. And God starts naming off all these surrounding nations that have played some part in subjugating Israel, or aiding and abetting in her exile and things like that. And so that's all language that on the near term is going to actually take place against those wicked nations who were in existence at the time that Israel went into exile in the 4th or 5th century, 6th century BC, like we're reading about in these prophecies. But on the larger scale, these refer to people groups that exist around Israel today. If you pull up a map of Israel, you'll see that she's surrounded by people who are not friendly towards her, right? Egypt in the south, Jordan to the east, Lebanon to the north, Syria to the north, Iraq and Iran to the north and east. She's surrounded by people who would, even right there in Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself is split between East and West Jerusalem. I have to keep reminding myself whenever I read about Jerusalem in the Bible that the Jerusalem of today is split along lines of East and West Jerusalem, and it's only West Jerusalem that is more or less Israel. And even then, it's got the 4 quarters that are separated, the Jewish quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Armenian quarter, and then the Catholic quarter. I think it's called Catholic, Orthodox quarter, whatnot. Even Jerusalem, even West Jerusalem, which is supposed to be Israel's side of Jerusalem, is sectioned off, and then you've got this slice in the middle as you go towards the Mediterranean Sea west, and then you run into Gaza Strip, which has been occupied not by Israel historically, but by either the Philistines of old, or now is occupied by the Arab groups of peoples, the Palestinians, Gaza Strip. But the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that side of the Jordan, is all occupied by Arab groups of peoples who are hostile to Israel. Would just as soon see Israel swallowed up and disappeared off the map. Why do I say all that? It's because even now, currently in the state affairs of Israel today, politically and religiously speaking, there's a lot of oppression there that God one day will have to sort all of that out. And so when we read through these prophecies and we see these names of cities and people groups, a lot has changed from this time in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel that we're going to be reading about till today, right? A lot of people have, Jerusalem has changed hands quite a number of times. She's been plowed under quite a number of times. She's been renamed quite a number of times, right? There's a lot of history there, ugly, and a lot of blood there, right? The soil is quite literally soaked in blood. And so in the end, it's not always easy to ascertain which people group God is referring to when he says, Tarshish or this person, that person. We can use a little bit of history and figure that out, but ultimately, places and people groups change names, and people get assimilated into other people groups, and they take on the name of another group, and so cultures change and disappear, rise and fall. So don't get too put off by some of these names if you can't match the one-to-one matchup between current map groups on Google today. So don't worry about that. The overall picture is that there's judgment coming on that part of the world for the wickedness that has existed for centuries and centuries in that part of the world, because it's a spiritual wickedness. Remember what Paul said in the book of Ephesians. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, people. We wrestle against the principalities and against the spiritual wickedness, against the darkness and the rulers of this world, right? It's a spiritual entity that can go back and forth around the world and draw wicked mankind into its program. So that's why we have to see this as a spiritual battle, a giant chessboard that's manipulating the humans and the nations, but at the same time, it's really a cosmic battle in the heavenlies, between forces that are much more powerful than any human could ever deal with.